Wir steigen ein ins Programm und was könnte das Thema sein, wenn nicht Corona, wenn nicht die Pandemie, wenn nicht die Krise, in der wir uns derzeit befinden. Seit mehr als 18 Monaten beschäftigt uns dieses Thema, bewegt uns dieses Thema und viele werden sich fragen, wie lange noch und was kommt dann eigentlich nachher. Da tut es manchmal gut, in die Geschichte zu blicken, um die Zukunft ein bisschen besser greifen zu können. Und wir haben ja vielleicht manchmal das Gefühl, es ist unglaublich, was hier alles passiert ist. Ich kann Ihnen das auch noch verdeutlichen. Schauen Sie sich mal folgendes Video an, aufgenommen gleich nach Ausbruch der Krise, April 2020. Wenn Sie sich das anschauen, das ist der Flugraum über Europa. Was sich da getan hat oder eben nicht mehr getan hat. Die Welt schien stillzustehen und wir alle, ich glaube, da spreche ich für uns alle, hatten manchmal das Gefühl, da geht ja gar nichts mehr, das ist beispiellos, so etwas haben wir noch nie erlebt. Dabei haben wir das alles schon erlebt, vielleicht nicht genau das im Detail, aber es gab schon immer Krisen, es gab schon immer Katastrophen. Haben Sie zum Beispiel schon mal von der attischen Seuche gehört? Eine Pandemie im Peloponnesischen Krieg, einige Jahrhunderte vor Christus, die sehr an die Pandemie erinnert, die wir im Moment jetzt mitmachen. Und manchmal tut es, wie gesagt, gut, wenn wir uns diese Ereignisse wieder ein bisschen vor Augen führen, damit wir vielleicht merken, wir stehen nicht alleine da in der Krise, die wir heute erleben. Und vielleicht gibt es ja das eine oder andere, das wir lernen können aus der Krise. Unser erster Referent hat genau das getan. Wir haben Wirtschaftshistoriker Niall Ferguson hier, der schon immer in die Vergangenheit geblickt hat, um eben die Zukunft besser greifen zu können. Er hat ein neues Buch herausgegeben, Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe, das uns genau das vor Augen führt. Es gab immer Katastrophen, es gab auch immer Krisen, nur haben wir es wirklich gelernt, aus diesen Krisen zu lernen. Das ist die große Frage. Also wo stehen wir im Moment in dieser Krise und wo könnte sie uns hinführen? Und wer weiß, was könnten wir vielleicht sogar daraus lernen? All das wollen wir jetzt hören. Wir sind sehr froh, ist er hier. Welcome, Niall Ferguson.
Meine Damen und Herren, verzeihen Sie mir, wenn ich auf Englisch rede. Es ist viel leichter für mich. Es ist ein großes Vergnügen, hier zu sein. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and to talk about doom, which probably sounds a rather depressing title for a book. But rest assured, the story that I'm going to tell you is anything but pessimistic. On the contrary, I want to try to persuade you that it is not the end of the world that you have to worry about. It's just how far you can improve your skills at disaster management. Doom is a history of disaster. All the disasters that you can think of are in this book. COVID-19, of course, is in the book, but so is the plague that struck Athens at the time of Thucydides. But it's not just plagues, the wars are there too. And not only the wars, but the wildfires, the floods, the boats that sank. If you want to know what really happened to the Titanic, don't watch the movie, read the book. Want to understand Chernobyl? Don't watch the TV drama, read the book. Let me offer you some historical insights into the disaster that we are still in, because it's not over. It's been a pretty big disaster, and it still has some considerable way to run. One can see this just by glancing at the data from Johns Hopkins on deaths each day in the world. It may feel as if the pandemic is over in some countries, but it's really not globally. But let's put this in perspective. So far, COVID-19 has killed about 0.056% of the world's population. Now that makes it 3 orders of magnitude smaller than the Black Death, or indeed the plague of the Emperor Justinian. Those catastrophic events may have killed up to a third of humanity. Just over a century ago, the 1918-19 Spanish influenza, as it was known, was around 29 times worse. In fact, this plague has only recently overtaken the 1957-1958 Asian flu in terms of the proportion of the world's population that it's killed. And who now remembers the 1957-58 influenza pandemic? Even if you accept the upper bound of deaths, the top estimate that The Economist recently published, which is that some 13 million people have lost their lives because of COVID-19, that is still 1/10 the death toll in relative terms of the 1918 influenza pandemic. And what we can learn from the history of influenza is in some ways encouraging. We are not going to eradicate COVID any more than we have been able to eradicate influenza. And like influenza, COVID will come back in new variants, and we will be contending with large waves at some future date, just as in the 1950s, new waves, new strains of influenza swept the world. Do you remember all those idiots, and they were idiots, early last year who said, oh, it's nothing to worry about, it's just the seasonal flu, it's just flu. And I was tearing my hair out, because that was exactly why you should worry about it. It's only recently that we tamed influenza, only recently that it became something that you got an annual jab about and thought little of. Eventually, we will get there with COVID, but it will take much longer than you expect. Gradually, it will go from being pandemic to being endemic. We will live with it, and the overwhelming majority of us will not die of it. Even last year, an American was more likely to die of heart disease or cancer than of COVID. Not only do we have vaccines with amazingly high efficacy. When I was finishing the book last year, we still didn't have the phase 3 results. So I was over the moon when those first came through from Pfizer. But we are slowly but surely deploying those vaccines, much more slowly than would be ideal, with enormous parts of the world far behind. As you can see, less than 3% of the population of Africa is vaccinated. That's why this isn't over. But we have the means of ending it, unlike the much larger and more disastrous pandemic that we have all lived through. The pandemic that killed 36 million people, the pandemic of HIV/AIDS, for which there was no vaccine. That's the odd thing. We've all lived through something worse than COVID. What about the economics? Okay, we're all entitled, especially here in Switzerland and probably even more in Germany, to worry about inflation. In the United States, people worry about inflation with more reason than I think in Europe, because of the scale of the fiscal and monetary stimulus, as well as the supply-side disruptions. It's reasonable to wonder for how long inflation will be as high as 5%, the most recent reading in the United States for consumer price inflation. But surely the big economic story is this: the world's incredible V-shaped recovery from last year's sudden stop. The sudden stop caused largely by lockdowns, by the non-pharmaceutical measures we had to take to try to contain the spread of the virus. Inflation may be higher than we've grown used to, but it's been too low over most of the last 20 years. This is a worry I sometimes think the central bankers want us to have. So on the economic side too, I think it's appropriate at a meeting like this, when we're finally all able to get back together and have live events, to accentuate the positive. People ask me every day about the ignominious end of the global war on terror, the scenes in Kabul as the last Americans left, the chaos that they left in their wake at the airport. You know, that's the least surprising thing that has happened this year. Back in 2003, I wrote a book, Colossus, entitled The Rise and Fall of the American Empire, pointing out that it was highly unlikely that the United States would be able to sustain its interventions in either Iraq or Afghanistan. To me, the surprising thing is that it took as long as 20 years. I expected the fall of Saigon to be reenacted much sooner than in 2021. But before you tell us, as some people love to tell me, that we're at the beginning of the Chinese century, notice that China's recent performance, not least beginning with the origins of the pandemic itself, you could sum up as how to lose friends and alienate people. Just look at the way in which attitudes to China have changed over the past few years. It's not just in the United States that sentiment has become much more negative towards the Chinese Communist Party and the leadership of Xi Jinping. It's in most European countries too, indeed in most developed countries, as well as in India, where for obvious reasons sentiment has grown a good deal more negative. The world order is changing, but it's changing in ways that I don't think are fully understood by those, particularly in the business community, whose minds are on other things than geopolitics. It's not inappropriate to use alpine imagery in a setting like Interlaken. And so I'm going to draw on Henry Kissinger's very striking image of foothills and mountain passes. Back in November 2019, I asked Henry Kissinger, whose biography I'm in the midst of writing, are we in a new Cold War? Are we in Cold War II, only with the People's Republic of China instead of the Soviet Union? And his reply was, we are in the foothills of the Cold War. We're in the foothills of the Cold War. Well, recently, he reassessed our situation and said, we're now in the mountain passes. In the mountain passes of Cold War. This is important to understand. If there is one thing that the pandemic has revealed very clearly, it is that Cold War is underway. A new and different Cold War, but one with profound implications, I would guess, for pretty much every business represented in this room. Are there any Swiss businesses that don't have a China strategy? There can't be many. Now, if we are in Cold War II, what does that mean for this part of the world? Here's the good news. Cold War I would have been fought across Europe. It's hard to believe that Switzerland would have been unscathed if it had turned into a hot war. But Cold War II is a trans-Pacific competition. Its most likely battlefields are very far from here indeed. NATO is no longer the key alliance that will contain the communist power in this Cold War. It's actually the Quad, the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, that Washington is looking to. Soon, it's happening, I think, already. Climate is going to become a part of this new Cold War. Because even John Kerry now acknowledges that half of all the increase in carbon dioxide emissions since the Paris Climate Agreement were accounted for by China. The central issue of climate will not be solved by Europeans or Americans reducing their emissions unilaterally. If China continues to charge its Teslas with electricity generated by burning coal, then we are not doomed, but condemned to contend with rising temperatures and all that they will bring in their wake. So while Cold War II is going to dominate the geopolitics of the next years, what about Europe? Well, Europe got rid of the United Kingdom. The Brits voted for Brexit. That actually makes it easier for Europe to continue to plod towards ever closer union. The project of a federal Europe is more realistic than it ever was when Britain was there to say no. But Emmanuel Macron's vision of strategic autonomy is a distant dream. Has it occurred to you how much the European countries in NATO have in common with the old Afghan army? If you withdrew American support, European armies would be about as able to resist an offensive as the Afghan armies were in Afghanistan in recent weeks. Strategic autonomy is something that Europeans talk about, but they are not willing to pay for. What's not to like about Cold War II if you're Switzerland? Especially if the crisis that might produce a war is as far away as Taiwan. I found this cartoon when I was thinking about how to end my talk, and it struck me as a rather delightful image of Switzerland snoozing its way through Cold War II. The only question you really have to ask yourselves as you look ahead to what could be a very prosperous time for this safest of havens is Swiss francs or Bitcoin? Which is it going to be? Ladies and gentlemen, in that sense, it's not doom that we have to fear. The end of the world is something we love to talk about. Indeed, it's hardwired into us because of the way the great religions visualize Judgment Day. In reality, the challenge we face is disaster management. And the insight that doom offers you is that really all disasters are at some level human-made, including COVID-19, including Cold War II. Even if a volcano erupts, it's a natural disaster. But it's only really a disaster if you've built a bloody great city right next to the volcano. We will have disasters. We cannot predict them, and we cannot prevent them. The challenge we have to confront is how to get better at disaster management. And if the book Doom can do anything, it's going to help us understand why we coped quite badly with a pandemic, something that people had been predicting, after all, for many, many years. Thank you very much, and I hope I've cheered you up.
Niall Ferguson, thank you very much. Niall, if you could join me here just for a small chat. I tell you honestly, the fascinating yet frustrating thing as a moderator talking to you is that I could literally ask you anything. And you always have something interesting to say. We have to reduce it to 8 to 10 minutes. So at the risk of being a little bit erratic with my topics, I'd like to take some of those themes and things you were talking about. Let's start at the end. That was quite striking. I actually read the book. I was tempted to watch Titanic. I was going for the book then instead. And one thing that left me wondering, something you alluded to in the end of your speech, is that time and time again we're caught by these disasters, by these catastrophes. And I got the impression we always kind of prepare for the last one, but never for the next one. Why is that?
This is a common problem to military historians. It's always said that generals prepare to fight the last war, but it turns out to be true of practically every form of human activity. Ask yourself, why was it that the public health bureaucracies of most Western countries did quite badly? It didn't really matter if they had a Trump or a Merkel. In the end, nobody can say that Western democracies handled the pandemic well. And I think the answer is that the key decisions were not really made at the top. They were made by public health officials who, certainly in the UK, acted as if they were dealing with a new strain of influenza. Mm-hmm. And this was one reason that they waited through January, February, and into mid-March before really taking any effective action.
Heavily driven by the Prime Minister, by the way.
Yes, but the same thing was happening in most countries. It was only in Taiwan and South Korea and a few others that really early testing and early tracing happened. So I think in many ways the public health officials were fighting the last pandemic, or at least they hadn't fully thought through what a highly contagious version of SARS might be like. Whereas the Taiwanese and the South Koreans had thought that through, and therefore they had a much more effective plan. And they knew what Larry Brilliant had in fact said many years before, the great American epidemiologist. In the case of a new pathogen, early detection and early action are the crucial things. Mm-hmm. And really most Western countries failed to learn that lesson.
It has been an international crisis, an international pandemic. Not all catastrophes are worldwide. Has that brought us together in a way, or do you feel it has fractured us even more, or has but bring us apart, for example?
I think that's a really interesting question to us, because in fact, if you look through the history of plagues, they tend to sow discord. Mm-hmm. It's not like a war, which tends to bring people together, because a plague increases your distrust, even of people that you know. Might they have the virus? So what we see in the periods of plague is in fact a decline of social cohesion. That's been really obvious in the United States, where I live, where polarization has become so extraordinary that even issues of public health, mask wearing, vaccines, have become issues of partisan politics. It's perhaps less true in a country like Switzerland, but if one looks at the world as a whole, the most striking consequence of the pandemic for me is the intensification of Cold War II, mm-hmm. and the fact that the US-China or Western China relationship has got really much worse. So no, I think plagues tend to divide us. They erode social capital nationally as well as internationally.
Let's speak about that international, maybe New Balance, Cold War II. Since you live in the United States, you have lived through the events of the last weeks, maybe even more intensely than we did. What happened in Afghanistan? And I think we can call it an American catastrophe. Mm. Do we witness the end of the American century, as many people say? No,
because you might have said the same thing in 1975. Yeah. Think of that image of the last Americans to leave Saigon. Many people at that time said it's all over for the United States. And for a period, really for 4 or 5 years, things went from bad to worse. Remember, in '79, when Jimmy Carter was president, not only did the Soviets invade Afghanistan and the Iranian Revolution happened, but in fact the Soviets and the Cubans were active in multiple theaters around the world. But then everything changed direction. With the election of Ronald Reagan and the ultimately disastrous reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Cold War came to an end. And I think the lesson of history is not to expect great powers to be like us. I mean, you and I are in the prime of life, like everybody here. We're all at our peak. But
for years and years to come.
I've been telling myself this for the last 25 years. But we're human beings. We're mortal, except Peter Thiel, but everybody else is going at some point to age, and I'm really sorry to break this to you, but we are all individually doomed. Individually doomed. But that's not true of great powers. A great power can have a bad decade and then come back. The British Empire didn't decline and fall after it lost the American colonies. I think what will be really crucial to watch is what happens over Taiwan. Because strategically, it matters 100 times more than Afghanistan. They do not make many semiconductors in Afghanistan. TSMC did not open a fab in Kabul any time in the last 20 years. But Taiwan in Cold War II is simultaneously Cuba, Berlin, and the Persian Gulf. If the United States fails to deter China, or if China invades, fails to expel China, that will be a huge turning point, comparable with the Suez Crisis in Britain's decline from imperial dominance. So I think that's the thing to watch. And by the way, I think a crisis over Taiwan is much more imminent than most of you probably realize. Indeed, it could happen at any point in the next few years, perhaps even next year after the Beijing Winter Olympics.
Having said that, and it hurts me maybe to finish up with a, or to end it with a doom outlook, but since you mentioned China and that seismic shift, where do you see this going? I mean, you say, okay, they're coming. We see all these new initiatives, and already in Afghanistan as well, the Chinese influence will be bigger than before. Is this the new world power to deal with?
It could be, but I'm going to end on an optimistic note, as I promised I would. In many ways, although it's economically far more successful, China has at its core the same problems that the old Soviet system had. It is an excessively centralized system in which the party is above the law. And as long as Xi Jinping is trying to increase his control over every Chinese adult and child, to the point that he is now the Asian tiger mom telling them all, that's enough screen time. I mean, this is the ultimate surveillance state that seeks to achieve a level of totalitarian control that Stalin and Mao could only dream of. It goes beyond George Orwell's 1984. And my profound conviction is that this will fail. That we are not, whether we're Chinese or Swiss or Americans or British, we're not designed to live in a surveillance state in which our every action, our every transaction is monitored. So my gut feeling is that China will disappoint and surprise us by the crisis that it gets itself into, and the United States will once again surprise us by its ability to reinvent itself and come back from apparently the brink. I tried to end on a positive note. I don't know how I did.
We'll take it. We'll take whatever you give us. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much indeed.
Pleasure. Thank you so much. Niall Ferguson.